Hello and welcome to our webinar, Gaining Advantage Through the Recession. My name is Matt Talbert and I am the Research Manager at ASCM. I would like to introduce our two presenters today, Morgan Swink, Professor and West Chair of Supply Chain Management and Executive Director, Center for Supply Chain Innovation at the Neely School of Business at Texas Christian University, and our Executive Vice President, Peter Bolsdorf, here at the Association for Supply Chain Management. Before we begin, we will save all question and answers at the end, so if you have any questions, please send them in the chat box. Peter, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Morgan. And so before I go through the agenda, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where did this webinar come from. So last fall during our Chief Supply Chain Officer Forum, Morgan had introduced some research that was done during the last recession, and we actually brought it forward and shared that with our chief supply chain officers, and it went over quite well. And we thought, and as we're all working our way through the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated recession, that it would be time to bring this forward again, refresh the research, and then share it out with all of you. So again, when we crafted the agenda, we wanted to put a little bit in there about, what can we learn from the past? What did it say before? How do we look at differences across industries? Because not all industries are created equal. When we think about resilience, what do we mean by that? Because you see that now in the trade rags, you see that on social media. What does it mean to be resilient? How do we respond to the current recession? And then what are the 5 S's for building that resilient supply chain? So we're going to treat this a little bit like a conversation. So I'm going to share a couple of things that we've learned through our corporate members as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic specifically. Then I'm going to kick it over to Morgan, and then he's going to take you through, again, the agenda. I'm going to pipe in every now and then to clarify some things and to ask some questions. Again, those of you that know me know that I am not afraid to do that. So again, if you think about the Association for Supply Chain Management, we have over 300 corporate relationships worldwide. 200 of them are in the Fortune 500. We have 60% of the Gartner Top 25, as part of our corporate base. And so we asked, about the concept of resilience and how people were thinking about it, within the COVID-19 recovery phase. And so what we know at this time is the following. We know that developing more resilient supply chains, investing in resilience, especially in the COVID-19 recovery and beyond, puts money in the bank and makes the world a better place at the same time. And so what do I mean by that? So what we're finding, again, as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, is that supply chain excellent or resilient supply chains sense the pandemic earlier, as early as November versus late sensors, if you will, in February. We also know that early sensors or more resilient supply chains balance supply and demand better. What we found is that early sensors or more resilient supply chains had higher average factory utilization in the November to March time span. We also know that the more resilient supply chains minimized service and cost impact to both customers and shareholders. So everybody got hit, but resilient supply chains didn't get hit as bad and were able to get back to baseline performance faster. And then the last one, which will probably be the subject of future webinars, is the idea that we see resilient supply chains really shifting a focus to circular business models, that net zero waste concept. And so, so we ask the question, what are you doing to become more resilient? And here's the list. So they're doubling down on digital investments. And again, if you think about just planning as one part of the digital capabilities that they're thinking about, how do I become more intelligent in demand management? How do I respond to supply-demand balancing activities? How do I strategically think about supply network design as I rebalance my global supply network to be more agile? Those kinds of things. The second thing we know is companies are focusing on full integration of risk management with their synchronized planning. So how do I identify risks early, scenario plan, and integrate it into my planning system, both strategic and tactically? Thirdly is, how do I think about more effective public-private collaboration? We've seen more collaboration across associations, public sector, private sector, as it relates to critical care parts and components. And so, one of the questions we're asking is, do major manufacturers and distributors think about, a critical care, product, as part of their portfolio? Talked about rebalancing global supply networks. Again, if you got caught, with single source in Asia, again, everybody can write a novel on that one. And then the last one is updating risk management playbooks for global health, like a pandemic, but we're also thinking about climate change. So if you think about catastrophic things that could happen as part of climate change, how does that really update your risk management? So again, looking back at the research that we looked at during our Chief Supply Chain Officer Forum, thinking about resilience in COVID-19 recovery, we know that supply chain excellent or resilient organizations are best suited to advance competitive advantage and capture market share during and after recession. And Morgan's going to tell you why. Take it away, Morgan.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate that overview. And I think much of what I'm going to show you here, which is getting a little more into the details, based on our study of the last recession, is very consistent with the overview that Peter just gave you, which is driven mostly by conversations that Peter and the folks at ASCM are having with companies that are going through the current situation. So as Peter mentioned earlier, this actually came from some research that I did 10 years ago, back just after the last recession, and published a couple of papers there, and I presented some of that last year as people were starting to think about, well, when is this next recession going to happen? Of course, at that time, we had no idea that a few months later we'd be in the situation we are. But what we're really trying to do here is look at different supply chain factors, supply chain management factors, how companies are managing their assets, how they manage labor, how they're managing working capital, to see if there's some key differences that we can identify that make some companies more resilient. And I'll talk about how we measure resilient as we go forward here. So essentially the study is taking the data from the last recession, which of course was 2008, 2009, and this is a plot of the GDP, U.S. GDP during that time period. And so what we're doing to identify firms that were more resilient to that recession is to look mainly at profitability. And one of the key measures of profitability that supply chain folks tend to use a lot is return on assets. And return on assets is basically return on sales times asset turnover, or the easier way of thinking about it is just how much net income or profit did I generate given the total asset mix that I have in the company. So what we're going to do is look at that profitability measure and define resilience in two different ways. First of all, I've got here recession impact. So by that, we're looking at what was the average profitability during the recession minus the average profitability in the 3 years prior to the recession, right? So we're saying how much of a dip. I mean, that difference is negative for almost everyone during a recession. So how much of a dip did profits take during that 2-year period? So that's recession impact. Then recession recovery is, let's look at profitability in the year post the recession, the 2010 year. So if we look at profitability in 2010, return on assets then, minus the average profitability before the recession, that gives us a sense of, well, how far did companies climb back up the curve, back up the profit curve? How much of their pre-recession profitability level did they recover in that year just after the recession? So one of these
So
measures,
Morgan.
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Morgan, Peter here again, poking my nose into this again, and we've talked a little bit about this. But if you were to characterize the year 2020 or 2019 and 2020, and you were to kind of put it into the pre, during, and post, categories, again, you're not holding this to to all of your investment portfolio, but where would you characterize the year 2020 as it relates to these categories? Just curious.
Yeah, well, we're right in the middle. Although
Right.
things are happening a lot faster in this recession, and for different reasons, but we're in the middle of it right now. So
Okay.
what we'd hope to do, what would be great to do is in a few more quarters, maybe look at doing the same kind of study, but looking at it on a quarterly basis and say, okay, well, let's look where companies were in early 2019 to late 2019, and then, how did they do through 2020? And then assuming we come out of this by the first couple of quarters of 2021, we could construct basically the same kind of metrics here.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that, Morgan, is because, again, if you think about the last 18 months or 24 months, let's just say 2018 and 2019, a lot of our corporate folks are really talking about this whole idea around the digital transformation roadmap. And we've talked about transformation, at quite length. And so it'll be interesting as we go forward in time, because we know a lot of the investments in this got laid before, I'll call it before the 2020 time period. So again, I just wanted to add that perspective into the dialogue and look forward to ongoing observations. So again,
yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and that'll be really interesting too. And I do think one of the big messages we're going to see here is that companies that are, and you've already mentioned it, more agile, more able to match supply and demand in an agile way, tend to be more resilient. Well, we're going to see that in this data. But of course, today, we've got a whole level of digital enablement and technology that support that agility that didn't exist back then. So that'll be something we'll look forward to trying to, evaluate and test out with the current data. So this is a kind of a baseline. This is how we're measuring resilience. The first thing we can do is just look at industries. Now, so what I did is I went back and collected all the financial data on about almost 2,000 firms in these 5 major industry sectors for, again, that time period from 2005 to 2010. And the first thing you notice is that, well, the recession didn't affect everybody the same. You can see here, you got oil and gas and mining on the left-hand side, the extraction, manufacturing, telecom, trade, mostly retail trade, and then business services. And manufacturing was hardest hit in terms of the profit change. That is how much did their profitability drop through the recessionary period. On average, about everybody lost 3 points, 3 percentage points on their average ROA through the recession. But that varied tremendously depending again what industry you're in. We did see that large firms tended to do a little bit better than small firms. There's a whole lot more variability with the small firms. There are actually some small firms that did pretty well, but many that didn't do well. The other thing we can look at is in terms of sales growth, and this is important in terms of comparing the 2008 recession with today. It's really not fully an apples-to-apples comparison for key reasons, but if we look at the sales growth change during that period, so sales growth during the recession versus sales growth prior to the recession, again, some industries were hit a lot worse than others. And it makes sense, if you look on the left-hand side of this graph here, it's the staple goods, grocery items, soap, cleansers, medical devices, drugs. Those things were pretty stable. I mean, everybody saw some depression in sales, but not nearly as much on that end as on the other side. So if you think about the other side of the graph, the right-hand side, you've got more discretionary goods, construction materials, cars, and on the services side, things like advertising that are discretionary, right? So one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're interpreting the data from the last recession is that recession was pretty much a demand shock for everybody. It did vary across industries, but everybody saw depressed demand to some extent or another. This current recession is not necessarily that way. Yes, there's a lot of industries that are seeing big demand shocks, but there are some industries that have seen, increases in demand. Obviously, PPE, hand sanitizer, toilet paper, all those things you see in the newspapers, they've seen increased demand. So they actually are experiencing more of a supply shock. So I'll try to address that a little bit as we go forward. Which of these findings make sense and which ones need to be, considered, considering the fact that the cause of this recession is not exactly the same as it was in 2008. Okay, so if we look just real quickly, what was it? What were the key traits that seemed to make some companies more resilient to the recession? And so here we're looking at what structures did companies have before the recession that seemed to make them better able to weather the recession? That is, their profitability drop during 2008 and 9 was less. They didn't see as much of a hit in product profitability. And the first thing is lean. If you look at the companies that did better, they tended to have lower levels of working capital. They'd had more velocity moving things through the system. Interestingly, on average, companies that had, if you think about inventory, you've got raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. The companies that had a greater proportion of their their inventories held as raw materials tended to do better. That is, they were able to postpone, so they weren't as committed to certain variations of product or forms of product, and that was a key component. And then we saw, some evidence that companies that just had better relationships with their suppliers, they paid their suppliers faster, they had lower transaction costs and expenses due to collaborating with suppliers and customers, tended to do better. The other big takeaway that we saw in the data was the cost structure side. So now this is kind of an interesting one. On average, companies that were more labor intensive as opposed to asset intensive tended to do better through the recession. And the takeaway there is it's easier to reduce labor than it is to reduce fixed assets, to shed assets. So and also those companies that had more productive employees did better. So one possible takeaway there is that if you can outsource, if you can outsource asset intensive processes, less productive processes, create a more variable cost structure, it's a lot easier to scale up and down to do that demand supply matching that Peter talked about earlier. Now, Peter also mentioned the early warning. Now, we didn't see this in the financial data necessarily, but that clearly has to have some benefit in terms of being able to respond to a massive change like that 2008 recession was. And we'll talk about that more later. Overall, this is...
Yep, Morgan.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Morgan. So again, just would like your insight on the following. So one of the things that we've seen recently, again, as companies start to think about their product portfolio, we've seen a great effort around companies trying to rationalize their SKU base. And so again, having talked with a couple of product folks, the idea is, maybe the consumer tilted, to this is what I want until there's nothing on the shelf. And so now they're saying, hey, companies, how do you get what I need back on the shelf? And we see, companies kind of rationalizing, the variation in their product portfolio, which then puts more volume through a particular asset. So SKU rationalization we see is something that people have really been thinking and working hard around. Any comment or insight on that one, Morgan?
Yeah, I think that's one way to get to the kind of lean structure that I'm describing here. And the current situation is clearly a great opportunity to do that. My experience with companies is usually two sides of the fence, right? The supply chain people want to supply chain professionals want to rationalize, and the marketing guys want to continue to proliferate. So maybe, a situation like this is a good opportunity to kind of tip the balance toward more of a streamlined, rationalized, lean structure. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to take advantage of that. The big takeaway I want to impress, on everyone in terms of this kind of preliminary look at is supply chain matters. A lot of these issues have to do with how supply chains are designed, how networks are configured, how resources are managed. And as evidence of that, we took kind of a side look at a couple of things. In that earlier study, I looked at companies that were ranked in the Gartner ranking. You mentioned Gartner earlier, Peter. They rank the top 25 companies every year. So I took the companies that were ranked in the years prior to the recession and compared, how did they do through the recession versus their rivals. So for every company, I found their closest 3 or 4 competitors. And overall, they did better. They did much better in terms of profitability. Now here I'm looking at ROE, but ROA also they did better. And they did they maintained market capitalization. So that's the size, the stock market appraisal of the company's value. They did a lot better through the recession. And also I looked at ASCM member firms, so Association for Supply Chain Management member firms during that same time period. And we saw similarly, companies that who had invested in that relationship, and if we take that as a proxy for, an intentionality about managing supply chain in an excellent way, well, they did better as well. They maintained 4% better sales growth, and then they also maintained a better market capitalization through the recession. So there's some, and all these numbers are statistically significant if that matters to you, but as a professor, I only want to look at those things that are actually statistically significant. And so this does show evidence that supply chain focus tends to matter. Okay, so moving forward, now we're not going to go through all of these, of course, but this is just a kind of an inventory of all the different factors or metrics that we looked at. So we looked at a lot of things in the expense area, different kinds of expenses, how they changed through the recession. I mentioned working capital, and working capital is basically cash and inventory and receivables for sales outstanding. Asset and debt profile. Then we looked at some productivity measures, asset productivity, plant. This PPE here is plant, property, and equipment, by the way. It's not the PPE that we've been hearing a lot about the last 6 months or so. But, sales to plant, property, and equipment, and then how well are we driving sales through employee efforts. So those are the kind of profile measures we look at. And then on the outcome side, we can look at sales growth, profit measures, and then again, I've already mentioned market cap, market value. So we look at how those things changed.
Yeah, if you go back one slide, I just wanted to reiterate for our audience that this is not a benchmark. And I know those of you that are part of our corporate, we have a benchmarking thing where we go out and we look at delivery reliability, responsive agility, cost, and assets. This is not that. This is actual research where we go out and get public data. And again, I just want to say kudos to Morgan because, again, this is a significant study of wide scope, in terms of the number one. And the thing that makes us especially happy about this one is that the data is all there, again, for public organizations. I think from a private entity standpoint, again, you're capturing all this data anyway, so it gives you an opportunity to see how well you're doing. So again, I just wanted to point out that this is not a benchmark. Actually, it's statistically validated data. So just wanted to double down on that, Morgan.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's an important point. A lot of times, if you look at studies, a big question is always, well, who participated in the study and why did they participate in the study? Is there a selection bias going on there? This is, like Peter suggested, this is every company in these industries that creates a financial report. So any publicly held company is included in this study. So it does tend to minimize that bias, hopefully. All right. So if we look at of all those metrics, which ones were statistically associated with greater resilience? That's what we're looking at here. So for every one of these arrows, that means that there was a statistical correlation between the change in this metric and the company's ability to minimize negative profit impact in the recession, right? So these resilient firms were really, really fast or really good at very quickly cutting expenses in these different areas, operating expenses overall, but specifically cost of goods sold and SG&A. SG&A, of course, sales, general, administrative, that's overhead types of expenses, expenses associated with managing transactions of all kinds. It has to do with management salaries. But think of it, I like to think of it as just the overhead functions in the firm, whereas COGS, cost of goods sold, that's more direct costs. So that would be purchase costs as well as direct labor costs. You can also see that the companies that were able to reduce working capital and reduce their cash conversion cycle or cash cycle more quickly tended to do better. Now the interesting thing about that though is, for those of you who are familiar with this cash-to-cash cycle, it's basically inventory days plus receivables days minus payables. So DPO is days of payables. So to reduce cash-to-cash, that means you should increase payables, but these companies actually reduced payables. So what that says is they actually paid their suppliers faster. They were still able to reduce their overall cash conversion cycle, but they didn't do it at the expense of the suppliers. They actually paid their suppliers faster. That suggested they were able to help their suppliers through the recession. On the asset side, you can see actually some of their asset ratios increased. They increased cash. Now they reduced inventory as a fraction of sales, but inventory as a fraction of total assets actually went up. And that's probably because their other assets were reduced. They were able to shed some of the other non-inventory assets. And I'll make the point, I think some of the companies were very good, getting back to this rationalization idea, they were good at rationalizing inventory and preserving inventory in those areas that were necessary to capture demand as it started to recover. And I'll show in this next slide, some of these companies actually grew market share through the recession, which is pretty amazing. They were able to shed some of their plant property and equipment, at least the PPE that had a lot of depreciation associated with it. That was an interesting one that jumped out. Companies that did better typically were able to reduce their depreciation expense, presumably by getting rid of some of their highly depreciable assets. And you see productivity measures grew in all three areas. So they were able to quickly slim things down to the most productive assets, most productive resources, and use those to drive sales. Now, the other point I'll make before I leave this slide, and Peter, if you want to jump in, feel free, but if you think about how you would go about making these kinds of changes, these aren't things that supply chain executives can do on their own. We're managing labor here, we're managing assets, we're managing working capital, we're managing cash. It's going to take a cross-functional effort with all the different functional areas to make these kinds of changes happen. So that may be a key aspect of agility that drives resilience, is the ability to work together across functions.
And Morgan, it'll be interesting to see this data recreated, again, as you compare 2008-9, the definition and the adoption of this end-to-end supply chain view was different then, though I think today we've seen a lot broader application of how do we think about supply chain. The other thing I just wanted to note is all of these are normalized, so they are true across industries. Again, I just wanted to verify that, which means, independent of what industry you're in, you're seeing the same impact. I just wanted to capture that out loud.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because we saw obviously the huge industry differences on the earlier slide. So what we did was we normalized everything. So all of these metrics that we're looking at are basically industry adjusted. That is, what is your working capital relative to the industry average for the industry that you compete in? That's what all these metrics represent. Thank you for pointing that out, Peter.
Yep.
So to take another cut at this, we said, okay, well, those are correlations. Let's look at differences between the leaders and the non-leaders, the laggards. So we took the 20% most resilient firms. So these firms, if you look at how fast they recovered, these firms were able to if you compare profitability to ROA in 2010 versus pre-recession levels, they were able to recover 12% of ROA in that post-recessionary year. They were able to grow sales 4% more than the recessionary period. So from going to pre-recession to post-recession, they were able to recapture sales growth at a 4% rate. They actually captured market share, whereas the rest of the group lost market share. On average, they lost about 1.1% share. The average company in this total data set had about 1.3% of the total market. So a 0.24% growth on a 1% base, that's a pretty big capture of market share. And they were able to recover, they came back a lot faster in the stock market, these top 20% firms. So this is about almost 400, about 380 firms out of a total sample of about 1,800. Okay. So again, you see the same kinds of differences here, reductions in expenses, whereas the non-resilient firms, their expense ratios went up. The resilient firms, the top 20%, were able to actually reduce those ratios, reduced inventories, et cetera. Now, one thing I want to point out here, we're talking about reducing inventories, reducing expenses. Again, remember, this recession was pretty much a demand shock for everybody. So I think if you are today in an industry that is experiencing a massive demand shock because of the COVID-19 situation, then these results make a lot of sense to you and would be very applicable. If, on the other hand, you're in pharmaceuticals or grocery stores or one of these areas that has actually not seen such a demand shock, staple goods of certain kind, it's more of a supply shock, then you might, it might not be great to be lean. We've already seen that the lean supply chain has actually been a hazard. It's been a detriment in some areas. So I just want to point that out. That's one of the key differences between the last recession and this one. Let's go ahead and move on. Again, this is reinforcing the prior findings. It's actually showing some of the levels of differences. So this is a little bit of a benchmarking thing, just for example, and we can share these, of course, if you want these slides. You want to think through this in a little more depth. But for example, in terms of inventory days, the average resilient firm was able to reduce their days on hand by about 3 days more than the non-resilient firms. So again, 3 days. Think about the average manufacturing firm, for example, has about 50 to 60 days on hand. So that's about 5% difference in terms of inventory reductions. Okay, so what can we take away from this, for companies today in terms of taking advantage of the downturn? And this will kind of reinforce some of the things that Peter mentioned at the beginning. But obviously, we're in very challenging times right now, and a lot going on to just try to maintain profits, survival, deal with people issues. But I think it is useful to think about this as an opportunity as well. It's an opportunity to rationalize, to rethink where we are strategically, where the company is in terms of products and markets and businesses. It's an opportunity to think through, to perhaps purge some obsolete inventories. Very few companies do a good job of that. We've done some studies of that in the past that have shown that, just about every supply chain has a healthy percentage of obsolete inventories in it. So it's a good time to kind of rethink the businesses that we're in and rationalize in a very intentional way, centralize activities, and get greater control over issues. One point, the fourth point under this focus bullet point, not all areas are getting hit the same, obviously. Some areas are experiencing greater demand shocks than others, so you need to make sure to, as you're rationalizing and think through, think of it in terms of a regional strategy, not a one-size-fits-all. Transformation can happen here. Again, it's a great opportunity to make some transformation. A lot of companies were thinking about things like, digital transformation, automation, remote work. Well, now we've had a pilot test for a lot of those things, and even more broadly, this is a great chance to kind of push the reset button on talent. Think about the talent mix that you have, the talent mix that you need. As you start to rehire and bring people back into the fold, this is a good chance to perhaps move them around, put them in a place that might be at a better application of their skill sets. If you're financially healthy, again, we saw some companies actually grew market share. It's a competitive situation. If you're financially healthy, if you're able to do some acquisition or some additional market growth activity, you can take share from some of the people who are not as resilient. And this is a great chance to try to build some supplier partnerships as well. To summarize all of this, I came up with this 5S. So many of you have heard of 5S, of course, in a kind of a lean manufacturing setting. Well, this is 5S's for resilient supply chain, and it's going to echo some of the things that we've already talked about. But if we think about the next recession or the next big problem, assuming we come out of this one, what can you do to build in capabilities to make your company and your supply chain more resilient? Well, early warning and scanning, I think we see good evidence that has a value to it, has a market value. Before this recession, I saw a study out of Arizona State a few months ago. Still, very few companies have very good visibility into their supply bases. Nobody knows what's going on past 2 tiers deep in their supply chain. And this is a good wake-up call to the importance of scanning market activity, all kinds of sources of disruption, whether those are disease-related like our pandemic or political actions or weather or other kinds of disruptive events. So it may make sense to invest in some scanning technologies and capabilities. Smart, what do I mean by that? Well, clearly we can, people are talking about AI. I think even without AI, most of us can do a better job of understanding the data that we have and developing some predictions from that. So that's one element of smart. The other element is just smart in terms of the organization being able to learn. So people are fighting fires right now, but I think if you can take some time to think about how can we capture the learning that we're experiencing through this pandemic. And I actually have another study that we've looked at that suggests that companies that intentionally learn from small disruptions can actually apply those learnings to the larger disruption events like the one that we're in now. So think about what can we do to look at what we're doing and what we're doing well and what we're not doing so well to build in some protocols that we can apply in the next big disruption. We talked about agility. So there's 2 dimensions of agility that I think that are crucial here. One is scalability and the other is shiftability. So by scalability, this is something I've already kind of referred to. Can we match supply and demand? Can we scale up and scale down? And clearly, companies that have a more variable cost structure who are able to take advantage of kind of on-demand capacity, think of Uber, in transportation, but there's all kinds of other types of on-demand capacity in terms of leasing warehouse space or even robots as a service, all those kinds of things that are much more scalable. And one of the things, as we move toward greater levels of automation, If you're buying that automation, that does not make you scalable. That makes you less scalable in terms of an economic sense. So be careful with increasing your fixed asset structure through purchasing a lot of automation. Maybe leasing it's a better way to go. By shiftable, what do we mean? Being able to shift from one product or service to another. And we've seen some great examples of that. Fabric companies, pillow companies shifting to face masks or other PPE equipment. How do you become shiftable? Well, it means investing in more generalized multi-purpose kinds of resources, whether that's equipment or employees. And it means developing lots of options, maybe not single sourcing so much. Now, these are more expensive options. Obviously, they cost more. To be scalable and shippable will cost you more. But I think what we're learning is that we need to look at these choices as not just cost minimization choices, but risk minimization choices. And we might need to be able to be willing to pay more in the sense of buying insurance to be able to deal with the next disruption. And the last one is sustainable. Of course, when you hear sustainable, you think of people. Of course, yeah, we want to do things that preserve and emphasize the value of people and the planet. But I also mean economically sustainable here. Look at lower risk options. And again, you think about your supply network. That might mean more local sourcing, more sourcing from stable economies, more mature sources, sources that themselves are more agile, scalable, shiftable. Again, that may come at a price, but the price might be worth it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Peter. Matt,
Yep.
If you have some questions, we can talk.
Yep. A couple of comments from me, Morgan, just kind of connecting the dots, right? So last week we held a Planning Excellence Leadership Forum with our corporate members, and one of the topics had to do with the shift from individual to organizational learning and the future of work for supply chain planning. And the idea there was, the concept's been around a long time, but moving your culture from analog to digital, is going to take all of, again, if you think about Peter Senge's fifth discipline, all of them. But the one thing that resonates with me, based on what you just described, was this idea around personal mastery and the adaptability of supply chain roles. And again, I know you've seen this one, but we've got planning roles, we've got sourcing roles, manufacturing roles, logistics and transportation roles, and then you've got all of the enabling roles around that one. And so one of the things that we discussed during this was, the need for, as technology continues to infiltrate our world, that these roles aren't going to go away, but they're going to need to be more adaptable, flexible, as you just described. And again, we talked about ways of doing that are, how do we ground them in standards? But the other thing that was interesting is there was quite a focus on embracing diversity, creativity, and continuous improvement. So this idea around we're going to all have to live with robots like Siri and Alexa and robots with arms and legs. But this human element of diversity, creativity, and continuous improvement. So again, I wanted to double down on that statement. And then the other one, again, I think if the big takeaway, in this whole conversation, both COVID recovery and recession is, how do you invest in being more agile? So how do you think about your business being able to respond to unplanned demand? I also want us to all stay tuned for, this double down and double clicking on circular business models, because I think that's an emerging trend that we've seen inside of our own corporate community, where people are actually thinking about how do I get to a net zero waste situation with all of this. So anyway, those are some of the comments I had. I just wanted to validate, the statements that you made. I love the 5S. Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to be able to copyright that, because the lean folks will probably come after you. So, so with that, any comments on my comments? Morgan. I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on. As much as we talk about technology kind of being the savior or the issue for a lot of these challenges we're facing, it really does come back down to people. And we've had a lot of conversations with executives who are contemplating or investing already in a bunch of technology, and asking them what's the biggest challenge you have. They never say, well, it's the technology itself, it's we can't get it to work, or I mean, those are issues, but it's more on the talent side. We don't have people who know how to apply this technology. We don't have people who are looking at the bigger picture. Yeah, we can solve problems. We can find solutions to problems, but to think about developing these larger capabilities like agility, like scalability, like shiftability, we need people who understand the end-to-end supply chain and can think at that level in order to make the most of these opportunities.
Great. Again, I just wanted to call out the demographics here. This is, again, for those that have hung with us, again, this is a major study. This is not a benchmark of a few companies. So again, as we start to look at this one using publicly shared data, this is actually telling us something. And so again, I want to say thanks to Morgan and team for this insight. Matt, I'm going to come back to you, and because I know you've been collecting chat questions, and so if you can kind of give us the first question.
Sure. Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. The first one that came in, and this was in response to something you said, Morgan. If some lean supply chains were a detriment during this recession, should we revisit the value of having a lean supply chain during good economic times?
Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that and I have to say, academics have been saying this for decades. We're too lean. But so we'll pat ourselves on the back for that. But hopefully we are learning to, one size doesn't fit all. The challenge is going to be that it's just so attractive, and we're so driven as supply chain professionals to continually be driving out cost, right? 1%, 2%, 3% every year. And lean has been a powerful paradigm in helping us do that, both kind of within organizations and across supply chains. But I think this current situation has brought into very clear relief, the risk that's associated with that. Now, are we going to, in the future, be able to forego that potential cost savings, in the name of preserving or managing risk? Can we look at buffers as having strategic value? It's going to be a challenge. It's going to require a mindset change. But I think if you're in an industry where you have discretionary demand for your product, it's not a staple, it's discretionary, and you also have high fixed asset structure, not a variable cost structure, I think you're very susceptible. You're going to be hurt the most by an overly lean supply chain in a massive disruption like this one. So especially in those industry contexts, I think we've got to rethink what it means to be lean in a supply chain.
Hey, Matt, so a couple of things. Again, I go back to last week's Planning Excellence. One of our thought leaders, was talking about, flow. And we had quite a debate on the idea that cost actually jeopardizes resilience. And so if you juxtapose, this traditional accounting-based, way of looking at our supply chain and our businesses versus how do you maximize flow of cash, to drive revenue, I think that, and again, the idea is you can't do both. It's either one or the other one. And so perhaps, as we start to introduce this idea around the adaptive enterprise, and demand-driven, flow-driven, models within the supply chain, again, I think that is an alternative way of thinking about, lean from another dimension. So again, I just wanted to bring forward the active conversation, that we're having with our corporate community. Okay, Matt, any next question?
Yeah, I think we've got time for two more. The next one, assuming the next recession will not be the result of a public health crisis, what key financial indicators should be observed as triggers for the next recession? Morgan, is that something that you could speak to, or something that you've found in your study or previous studies?
Yeah, well, that's probably outside my realm. I mean, if I could predict the next recession, I would be, a millionaire. Who knows? I mean, who would have thought that this recession, we were talking about it a year ago, but we were thinking in the same terms as 2008. We were thinking a financial crisis, some kind of, financially driven thing. So I think actually, well, who knows? Who knows? Trade is going to be a big issue too, the global trade situation and the dynamics there. I think most of us were thinking that's what was going to trigger this next recession, but it didn't happen that way.
So Matt, one of the things that we talked about in the Chicagoland Food and Bev webinar previously was, this idea of resilience being, a factor that survives across multiple, recessions. So the idea is you're going to have disruptions happen bigger and more frequently and not quite sure where they're coming from. So the idea is, how do you invest in, resilient practices, resilient technology, resilient factors, the 5 S's, again, to mitigate that, because again, everybody is affected by that. So, so I would come back and answer that, follow the 5 S's. Back to you, Matt.
All right, I believe we have time for one more question. Based upon your research and analysis of previous recessions, when do you think we will see growth again? And I know that's a $1 million question.
Yeah, I really don't feel qualified to answer that, but if we get a vaccine in the next 4 months, it's gonna solve all our problems, right? But who knows? That's Peter. You want to venture a guess at that?
I can't. All I can say, and Matt, and this because you helped with the research, is we do know that those folks that are, regardless of the pre, during, and post, we do know, again, kind of to summarize, we do know that companies who are investing in their supply chains, experience less of a fall, they come back faster, and they grow share. And so the idea is, leaders, supply chain excellent leaders have always been doing that, and they're going to continue to do that. The interesting thing is there are some laggards that are just waking up and smelling the coffee. And it'll be interesting to see how they take this particular recession and the obvious supply chain impact that it has, had, and how they invest. It's really that group of people that we're interested in watching, in the next period of time. So great. Well, so Matt, enough for the questions. I just personally wanted to say thanks to Morgan. Again, stay tuned. This is the first view of the research. More to come on this one. We see this as a feature in how ASCM is going to provide, support and services to our corporate members. How do we learn from the 5 S's and help positioning, our corporate members for success in the future. So again, Morgan, I say thank you for the time and effort, and for everybody on the audience, stay tuned. Matt, any final words?
No, I just wanted to thank you both. And since we ran out of time for additional questions, I invite anyone to send any questions after the webinar to research@ascm.org, and we will pass those along. But Peter, Morgan, thank you both so much for your time today, and that concludes the webinar. All content and materials included in this webinar are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.